"You don't deserve that robe, you uppity bastard," Detective Rebecca Foster screamed, before kicking Judge Terence Harrison hard in the stomach, right there in open court. But that kick instantly became the beginning of the end for a career built on lies and murder. This wasn't just an assault on a black judge, it was the moment someone finally pushed too far in front of the wrong person. Foster had no idea the man she just attacked had been quietly reviewing files that certain people desperately wanted to stay buried forever, including video evidence about a case that destroyed families and covered up the execution of a black teenager. What started as routine criminal court became the spark that would ignite a federal investigation exposing corruption at the highest levels. Watch till the end, because this time when the system tried to protect its own killer cops, the whole foundation cracked, and what came next changed everything for those who thought murdering black children was acceptable. The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Courtroom 7A in the Riverside County Criminal Justice Center, where the worn wooden benches had witnessed decades of families seeking justice for their most vulnerable. But this Tuesday morning would be different. This would be the day when 15 years of systematic racism would finally explode in the face of the wrong person. If you believe that no one should ever face police brutality for simply making eye contact, type justice below. Then comment your country and city. Let's see where people stand against racial profiling worldwide. Your participation shows that accountability knows no borders. Judge Terence Harrison adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed the case file that had been keeping him awake for 3 nights straight. The document in his hand seemed routine at first glance. A 15-year-old black girl named Jasmine Taylor, charged with disorderly conduct and threatening behavior toward a law enforcement officer. The accusation, typed in the same clinical language he had seen dozens of times before, described a child who had allegedly displayed aggressive posturing and refused to comply with lawful commands in a respectful manner. But Judge Harrison had learned to read between the lines of police reports, especially those bearing the signature of Detective Rebecca Foster. At 48 years old, with 22 years of legal experience behind him, he had developed an instinct for recognizing patterns that others preferred to ignore, and Foster's name had been appearing in his courtroom with disturbing frequency. Always involving black teenagers, always with the same vague charges, always with language that criminalized normal adolescent behavior. Jasmine sat in the front row, her school uniform pressed and neat despite the circumstances, hands folded in her lap with the careful dignity of a child who had been taught that survival often depended on making herself as small and non-threatening as possible. Her father, Victor Taylor, kept one protective arm around her daughter's shoulders while clutching a folder containing honor roll certificates, teacher recommendations, and community service awards, evidence of a child whose greatest crime was existing while black in Detective Foster's patrol area. Wait until you see what Foster says when she realizes who she's really dealing with. The courtroom door opened with deliberate force, brass hinges protesting under the weight of Detective Rebecca Foster's entrance. At 5'10", with the kind of solid build that came from years of tactical training, Foster filled the doorway like a woman stepping onto her own personal stage. Her dark blue uniform was pressed to military precision, the weight of her duty belt and service weapon creating the distinctive swagger of someone who had never been seriously challenged by civilian authority. Foster's cold gray eyes swept the courtroom with practiced arrogance, lingering on Jasmine with the cold calculation of a predator who had found her target. When her gaze shifted to Judge Harrison, something flickered across her expression. Not quite disrespect, not yet, but the subtle dismissiveness of someone who viewed black men in positions of authority as temporary obstacles rather than legitimate threats. Judge Harrison observed this performance with the steady composure of someone who had spent decades watching people like Foster assert their dominance through body language and barely concealed contempt. He had seen this particular brand of arrogance before, had learned to recognize the telltale signs of officers who believed their badges granted them immunity from consequences. But what Foster didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have suspected as she settled into the witness chair with casual ownership, was that Judge Harrison had been building a case against her for months. Hidden in his private files was a manila folder containing evidence that would destroy not just her career, but the entire network of corruption that had protected her throughout her 15-year reign of terror against black youth in Riverside County. Her next words are going to shock you beyond belief. The silence in courtroom 7A felt different this morning, charged with the kind of tension that preceded lightning strikes. Foster arranged herself in the witness chair like a queen claiming her throne, completely unaware that she was about to confess to crimes that would send her to federal prison for the rest of her life. "Detective Foster," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had learned to command respect through competence rather than intimidation. "Please describe the events that led to Miss Taylor's arrest." Foster leaned back slightly in the witness chair, a gesture that would have been subtle if not for the context. In a courtroom where respect for judicial authority was foundational, even small displays of casual disregard carried significant weight. "Your Honor, I was conducting routine patrol in the East Side District when I observed a group of juveniles loitering near the Metro bus stop at 5th and Henderson. Based on recent reports of drug activity in the area, I decided to conduct a community wellness check." Judge Harrison made a careful note, his pen moving deliberately across the legal pad while his mind processed the familiar euphemisms. Community wellness check was Foster's preferred term for what civilian observers might describe as harassment of teenagers who had committed no crime beyond waiting for public transportation while black. And how many juveniles were in this group? 5 total, 4 males and 1 female, all appearing to be between 14 and 17 years of age. Yet only Miss Taylor was arrested. Can you explain the basis for that decision? For the first time, Foster's confident demeanor flickered slightly. She glanced toward the prosecutor's table, perhaps expecting support that wasn't forthcoming, before returning her attention to Judge Harrison. The other subjects dispersed immediately upon my approach. Miss Taylor displayed behavior that required additional intervention. But this wasn't Foster's first time targeting black teens, and Judge Harrison knew it. In his private chambers the previous evening, Judge Harrison had spread Foster's case files across his desk like pieces of a disturbing puzzle. The pattern was undeniable. 17 arrests in the past 18 months, 16 involving black teenagers, all charged with variations of disorderly conduct or threatening behavior. The language in her reports was remarkably consistent, as if she were working from a template designed to criminalize normal adolescent responses to police encounters. Marcus Johnson, 16, arrested for aggressive eye contact and failure to immediately comply with verbal commands. Destiny Parker, 15, charged with displaying hostility through body language and tone of voice. Trevor Stevens, 14 years old, arrested for clenched fists indicating potential for violence. Each case had been plea bargained down or dismissed on technicalities, ensuring that Foster's methods never faced serious scrutiny. But there was one name that appeared in Foster's files that made Judge Harrison's blood run cold. Andre Robinson, 16 years old, shot and killed during what Foster described as a routine traffic stop gone wrong. The official report claimed Andre had reached for a weapon, forcing Foster to use deadly force in self-defense. The case had been closed after a brief administrative review, with Foster receiving a commendation for heroism under fire. What she found in those files would shock you. "Detective Foster," Judge Harrison continued, consulting his notes with practiced precision, "you mentioned that Miss Taylor displayed concerning behavior. Could you be more specific about what you observed?" Foster's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She maintained direct eye contact when I gave lawful orders for the group to disperse. When I addressed her specifically, she didn't immediately lower her gaze or acknowledge my authority. Her posture remained confrontational throughout the encounter." The words hit the courtroom like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of discomfort that spread through the gallery. Victor Taylor felt his daughter's hand tighten in his, while several observers shifted uncomfortably at the stark honesty of Foster's admission that she had arrested a child for making eye contact. Judge Harrison set down his pen and looked directly at Foster, his dark eyes meeting her pale ones with unwavering composure. "Detective, are you testifying under oath that maintaining eye contact constitutes disorderly conduct?" Foster's face flushed slightly, but her voice remained steady. In my professional experience, prolonged eye contact can be a precursor to aggressive behavior. We're trained to recognize these warning signs before situations escalate. And in your professional opinion, what would constitute appropriate behavior from a 15-year-old black girl during a police encounter? The question landed with surgical precision, forcing Foster to either admit to unconstitutional policing practices or reveal her racist assumptions about how black children should behave in the presence of white authority. Foster shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair, perhaps sensing that she was being led into dangerous territory, but unable to resist defending her actions. The same as any other teenager: immediate compliance, respectful language, no challenging behavior or attitude problems. Judge Harrison made another note, each question and answer building towards something that everyone in the courtroom could feel approaching but couldn't yet define. And if a child asks questions about why they're being stopped, questions are often just disguised arguments, Foster replied, her irritation beginning to show. A respectful person follows instructions first and asks questions later through proper channels. The answer revealed more than Foster intended, exposing a worldview where questioning police authority, even legal, constitutional questioning, was inherently suspicious. Judge Harrison had heard variations of this philosophy before, usually from officers who viewed their badges as licenses for unchecked power rather than symbols of public service. Behind his calm exterior, Judge Harrison's mind was racing through the implications of Foster's testimony. He had spent the previous weekend reviewing not just her arrest records, but the broader statistics from her precinct. The numbers painted a disturbing picture. Black teenagers in Foster's patrol area were arrested at rates 17 times higher than their white counterparts, despite demographic data showing no corresponding difference in actual crime rates. What he found in those files would shock you. The breakthrough had come 3 days earlier, when Detective Raymond Barnes from Internal Affairs had quietly approached Judge Harrison with concerns about Foster's methods. Barnes, a 20-year veteran of the force, had been conducting his own investigation after receiving multiple complaints from community leaders about Foster's aggressive tactics toward minority youth. "Judge Harrison," Barnes had said during their confidential meeting, "I've been trying to build a case against Foster for 2 years, but every time I get close, evidence disappears or witnesses become reluctant to testify. There's something you need to see." The manila envelope Barnes had handed him contained photocopied documents that should never have left police custody. Foster's original incident report from Andre Robinson's shooting, complete with handwritten notes that had been omitted from the final official version. The discrepancies were staggering. In her initial report, Foster had written, "Subject appeared to be retreating when engagement began," but the final version stated, "Subject advanced aggressively toward officer position." The original noted, "No weapon recovered at scene initially." The official report claimed, "Subject's weapon recovered 15 feet from body." Most damning of all, Foster's preliminary notes included the phrase, "uncertain about threat level at time of shooting." Judge Harrison had read those documents with growing horror, understanding that he was looking at evidence of a cover-up that reached far beyond one officer's mistakes. Someone with significant authority had helped Foster transform a questionable shooting into a heroic act of self-defense. Foster had no idea she was about to confess to something much worse. "Detective Foster," Judge Harrison said, his voice taking on a sharper edge that made several people in the courtroom sit up straighter, "in your 15 years of law enforcement, how many juveniles have you arrested for behavioral violations?" Foster's eyebrows rose slightly. Perhaps surprised by the change in direction, but not yet concerned. "I don't keep exact tallies, Your Honor. Probably 60 or 70 cases over the years. Most get resolved without trial. Kids learn their lesson and stay out of trouble." "Of those 60 or 70 cases, what percentage would you estimate involved minority juveniles?" The question dropped into the courtroom like a stone into still water. Foster's confident expression flickered, and she glanced around the room as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "I don't pay attention to race, Your Honor. I respond to behavior, not demographics." "That's admirable, Detective, but surely you can provide a rough estimate. Half? 3/4?" Foster's hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests of the witness chair, clenched into fists. "I patrol an area with diverse demographics. The arrests reflect the population I serve." Judge Harrison consulted his notes with deliberate precision. "According to census data, your patrol area is 38% black. Would you say your juvenile arrests reflect that demographic breakdown?" The mathematical precision of the question left no room for deflection. Foster's face had gone pale, and when she spoke, her voice carried an edge of desperation that hadn't been there before. "Your Honor, I don't think racial statistics are relevant to this case. We're here about one specific incident involving one specific individual who displayed inappropriate behavior." His next words revealed everything. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Foster's increasingly uncomfortable face. "Actually, Detective Foster, pattern of behavior is absolutely relevant to credibility. When an officer's arrest record shows extreme racial disparities, it raises questions about motivation and judgment." Foster's composure was beginning to crack, revealing the anger that always lurked beneath her professional facade. "Your Honor, with respect, I've served this community faithfully for 15 years. I've put my life on the line to protect citizens, including citizens who look like you." The phrase "citizens who look like you" hit the courtroom like a verbal slap. Judge Harrison felt the collective intake of breath from the gallery, the sharp shock of witnessing someone cross a line that should have been inviolate. But he also felt something else rising inside him, not anger but the cold, crystalline clarity that came when someone revealed their true nature so completely that pretense became impossible. "Detective Foster," Judge Harrison said, rising slowly from his chair, "your service record is not being questioned. Your methods, your judgment, and your apparent belief that a citizen's race determines their worthiness of constitutional protection, those are being questioned. And rightfully so." Foster stood as well, her height making her tower slightly in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. The physical presence was obvious: Foster's 5'10" frame and tactical gear versus Judge Harrison's position behind the bench. But everyone in the courtroom understood that true power in this space came not from physical presence, but from moral authority. Foster had no idea she was about to confess to something much worse. "Look, Your Honor," Foster said, her voice dropping to a tone that carried barely concealed menace. "I know what this is really about. This is about politics, not justice. This is about protecting criminals instead of victims. This is about turning law enforcement into social work." The mask was beginning to fall away, revealing the raw prejudice that had always driven Foster's policing style. Judge Harrison remained standing, his posture straight and dignified, despite the obvious threat in Foster's words. "Detective Foster, this is about equal protection under the law. This is about whether a 15-year-old girl has the right to exist in public space without being criminalized for the color of her skin." Foster's face flushed red with barely controlled rage. "You people always twist things," she snarled, her voice rising to a level that made several observers shift nervously. "You always make it about race when it's about respect. It's about law and order." The phrase "you people" sealed her fate, removing any possibility of walking back her confessions or claiming her words had been misunderstood. Judge Harrison had heard enough to understand that the woman standing before him represented everything wrong with American policing: the casual racism, the abuse of authority, the belief that badges granted immunity from basic human decency. But he also knew that Foster's revelations were just the beginning. Hidden in his desk drawer was evidence that would expose not just her individual crimes, but the entire system that had protected and enabled her throughout her career. "Mr. Santos," Judge Harrison said, addressing his court administrator, "please retrieve the evidence folder from my chambers. File marked Robinson Investigation." Foster's face went white at the mention of Andre Robinson's name. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she looked genuinely afraid, understanding that her carefully buried secrets were about to be dragged into the light. "Your Honor," Foster said quickly, her voice taking on a pleading quality that contrasted sharply with her earlier arrogance, "I don't know what kind of games you're playing with old files, but this case is about Jasmine Taylor, not ancient history." Judge Harrison smiled slightly, the expression holding no warmth but considerable satisfaction. "Detective Foster, nothing about Andre Robinson's murder is ancient history. And what I'm about to show this court will prove that Jasmine Taylor is simply your latest victim in a pattern of racist violence that has been protected by administrative corruption for far too long. What you're about to hear will make your blood boil." The courtroom fell into absolute silence, as everyone present understood they were about to witness something that would change everything. Court Administrator Gabriel Santos returned from Judge Harrison's chambers, carrying a thick manila folder and a laptop computer, his movements precise despite the obvious weight of what he was carrying. The folder bore official police department seals and evidence tags. But Judge Harrison knew that the most damning contents had never been intended for public viewing. "Detective Foster," Judge Harrison said, opening the folder with deliberate care, "I'd like to discuss your encounter with 16-year-old Andre Robinson on March 15th, 2 years ago. Do you recall that incident?" Foster's hands were trembling now, her earlier swagger completely evaporated. "That case was closed after a thorough investigation. I was cleared of any wrongdoing and received a commendation for heroism under fire." "Yes, the official report does paint you as quite the hero," Judge Harrison agreed, pulling out a document and holding it up for the courtroom to see. "According to this final incident report, Andre Robinson was an armed suspect who threatened your life, forcing you to use deadly force in self-defense." Foster nodded eagerly, perhaps thinking she was being thrown a lifeline. "That's correct, Your Honor. The subject was reaching for a weapon when I fired. It was a textbook defensive shooting." Judge Harrison set the official report aside and picked up another document. This one bearing Foster's handwriting and the original date stamps that proved its authenticity. "That's interesting. A detective, because your initial incident report tells a very different story. The video they tried to destroy was about to surface. Your Honor, I don't know what document you're holding, but if it contradicts the official findings..." "This is your original incident report, Detective Foster, filed electronically at 11:47 p.m. on March 15th, exactly 4 hours and 23 minutes after you shot Andre Robinson." Judge Harrison's voice carried the precision of someone who had spent months verifying every detail. "Would you like me to read your initial observations to the court?" Foster's face had gone ashen. She understood that whatever was in that document would destroy the carefully constructed narrative that had protected her for 2 years. "Your Honor, preliminary reports are often inaccurate due to the stress of critical incidents. Subject appeared to be running away when engagement began," Judge Harrison read aloud, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. "No weapon visible at time of first shot. Subject fell immediately and did not move after impact." The words hit the courtroom like physical blows. In the gallery, several observers gasped audibly as they processed the implications of Foster's own words. Andre Robinson hadn't been threatening Foster. He had been running away when Foster shot him in the back. Judge Harrison continued reading from Foster's original report. Subject was approximately 15 feet away and moving away from officer position when shots were fired. No weapon recovered at scene initially. Unknown why subject was in area at time of contact. Foster tried to interrupt, her voice cracking with desperation. "Those are preliminary observations made under extreme stress. The official investigation determined..." "The official investigation was a cover-up," Judge Harrison said quietly, but his words carried with absolute authority. "And you're about to find out exactly how extensive that cover-up was." He gestured to Gabriel Santos, who had been setting up the laptop computer with practiced efficiency. The courtroom's large monitor flickered to life, displaying a media player interface that made Foster's remaining color drain from her face completely. "What the court is about to see," Judge Harrison announced, "is body camera footage from Detective Foster's encounter with Andre Robinson. This is the original unedited footage that was ruled inadmissible due to alleged technical difficulties." Foster was on her feet instantly, her professional composure completely shattered. "Your Honor, that footage was sealed by departmental order. If someone has accessed classified evidence..." "The footage was leaked to me by someone who couldn't live with the silence anymore," Judge Harrison replied calmly. "Someone who understood that covering up murder makes you complicit in it." Her reaction when the video started playing was priceless. The monitor displayed the timestamp, March 15th, 9:23 p.m. The jerky, low-resolution quality of body camera footage filled the screen, accompanied by the sound of Foster's breathing and the distant hum of traffic. The camera bounced as Foster moved, showing glimpses of a residential street where porch lights created pools of yellow illumination in the darkness. Subject spotted on foot, moving between parked vehicles, Foster's recorded voice said, steady and professional. Appears to be juvenile male, approximately 16 to 18 years of age. The camera captured a slight figure in dark clothing, moving carefully between cars, obviously trying to avoid detection. There was nothing threatening about Andre Robinson's movements. If anything, he looked like a scared kid trying to get home without attracting attention. Foster's live voice cracked as she watched her own footage. Your Honor, please, this is taken completely out of context. But Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence as Andre Robinson's face became visible on screen. Young, frightened, clearly unarmed, hands raised in a gesture of surrender that Foster had omitted from every official report. The best part is coming up. The body camera footage continued with devastating clarity, showing Andre Robinson backing against a chain-link fence with his hands raised high above his head. His voice came through the courtroom speakers, young and terrified. Please don't shoot, officer. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just walking home from my job at the grocery store. Foster's recorded voice responded with cold professionalism. Subject displaying suspicious behavior and potential threat indicators, preparing to assess compliance level. But the video showed something entirely different. Andre wasn't displaying threatening behavior. He was cowering against the fence, tears streaming down his face, desperately trying to make himself appear as non-threatening as possible. His grocery store uniform was clearly visible, along with the name tag that identified him as an employee. I don't have any weapons, Andre's voice pleaded through the speakers. You can search me. Please, I just want to go home to my little sister. Foster's current reaction in the courtroom was a study in psychological collapse. Her face had gone from pale to grey, sweat beading on her forehead despite the courtroom's cool temperature. Your Honor, that video doesn't show the full context. There were intelligence reports about armed suspects in the area. Detective Foster, Judge Harrison interrupted, consulting another document from his folder. There were no intelligence reports about armed suspects. There were no radio calls about suspicious activity. There were no reports of any crimes in that area on March 15th. The evidence continued to mount against Foster's fabricated narrative. Judge Harrison pulled out a time-stamped radio log showing that Foster had never called for backup, never reported suspicious activity, and never indicated that she was pursuing an armed suspect. Her next words revealed everything. On the monitor, Andre Robinson's final moments played out with terrible clarity. The boy remained pressed against the fence, hands visible, making no threatening movements when Foster's voice suddenly changed tone. Subject reaching toward waistband area. Threat assessment indicates immediate danger to officer safety. But the camera clearly showed Andre's hands never moving from their raised position. His final words echoed through the silent courtroom. Please don't hurt me. Tell my mama I love her. The gunshots came without warning. 3 rapid shots that sent Andre crumpling to the ground. The body camera captured Foster approaching the motionless body, and her whispered words were picked up by the sensitive microphone. Stupid kid. Should have known better than to run in this neighborhood. The courtroom erupted in shocked gasps and angry murmurs. In the gallery, several people were openly crying, while others sat in stunned silence at witnessing the cold-blooded execution of a terrified child. Foster's face was now completely white, her hands shaking as she gripped the witness chair. Your Honor, Foster said desperately, you have to understand the pressures officers face in the field. Split-second decisions, life-or-death situations. Detective Foster, Judge Harrison's voice cut through her excuses like a blade. What we just witnessed was not a split-second decision. That was the deliberate execution of an unarmed child who was begging for his life. Foster's composure finally shattered completely. Standing at the witness stand, she began shouting with the desperate rage of a cornered animal. You think you understand police work? You think sitting in your fancy robe gives you the right to judge officers who risk their lives every day? I think murdering children and covering it up with false reports makes you a criminal, not a hero. Judge Harrison replied with devastating calm. Foster took a step toward the bench, her movement aggressive enough to make court security tense for action. "You people always twist everything. That kid was trouble. I could tell just by looking at him. He was going to end up dead or in prison anyway. I just saved society the trouble." What she said next will shock you. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke, revealing Foster's racist worldview with crystalline clarity. She had just confessed to executing a child based on nothing more than racial prejudice and the assumption that black teenagers were inherently criminal. Judge Harrison felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest as he realized Foster had just provided the confession that would end her career and her freedom forever. But he wasn't finished with her yet. There was still one more piece of evidence that would expose the full scope of the conspiracy that had protected Foster's crimes for years. "Detective Foster," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who held all the cards, "since you seem so willing to share your philosophy about policing black youth, perhaps you'd like to explain this audio recording to the court." He nodded to Gabriel Santos, who clicked another file on the laptop. The courtroom speakers crackled to life with voices that were immediately recognizable as Foster and another woman, recorded in what sounded like a bar or restaurant setting. Foster's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, and finally, cold calculation, as she realized that her private conversations had been preserved for posterity. "What you're about to hear will make your blood boil. The problem with policing today," Foster's recorded voice said, slightly slurred but unmistakably hers, "is that we're not allowed to do our jobs properly anymore. Every time we take down one of these punks, some bleeding heart judge starts crying about excessive force." The second voice, identified by Judge Harrison as Captain Victoria Bradley, Foster's immediate supervisor, responded with a harsh laugh. "Tell me about it. Remember that Robinson kid? Little thug got exactly what he deserved, but we had to dance around the family's feelings for months." Foster's recorded voice continued with chilling casualness. "That boy was asking for it, walking around like he owned the neighborhood, probably dealing drugs or planning some gang initiation. These kids need to learn that actions have consequences." "Too bad there aren't more cops willing to teach that lesson," Bradley replied. "Maybe we'd have fewer problems in these communities if more of them understood what happens when you don't respect authority." Foster laughed, the sound echoing through the courtroom with bone-chilling cruelty. "Don't worry about that, Victoria. I make sure every kid in my patrol area knows the score. Most of them learn real quick after they hear what happened to their friend Andre." Her reaction when she heard her own voice was priceless. Foster's current face had gone ashen as she listened to her own words, celebrating the murder of a 16-year-old boy. Around the courtroom, people sat in stunned silence as they processed the casual way Foster and her supervisor discussed using murder as a tool of intimidation against black youth. The recording continued for several more devastating minutes, documenting conversations between two police officers who viewed the execution of children as acceptable policy as long as the victims were black. Foster could be heard describing other encounters where she had used excessive force while Bradley provided administrative cover and encouragement. "Where did you get that recording?" Foster whispered, her voice barely audible above the courtroom's ventilation system. "Someone who couldn't live with the conspiracy of silence anymore," Judge Harrison replied. "Someone who understood that protecting murderers makes you an accessory to their crimes." Foster realized that her secret thoughts had been documented and preserved, that her casual confessions of racial hatred and violence were now part of the legal record. Her earlier bluster and aggression had evaporated, replaced by the hollow look of someone watching their entire world collapse. "Your Honor," Foster said desperately, "those conversations were taken out of context. Officers sometimes use dark humor to cope with the stress of dangerous work." "Detective Foster," Judge Harrison interrupted, "we just heard you and your supervisor celebrating the murder of a child and discussing how to use that murder to terrorize other black youth in your patrol area. There is no context that makes that acceptable." The weight of Foster's exposed crimes hung over the courtroom like a toxic cloud. Judge Harrison could see faces in the gallery that reflected shock, horror, and something deeper. The recognition that they had witnessed the mask being stripped away from institutional racism to reveal the ugly reality beneath. But the judge wasn't done with her yet. Foster slumped in the witness chair, as if the weight of her exposed crimes had become physically unbearable. The confident swagger she had displayed upon entering the courtroom had been replaced by the desperate posture of someone watching 15 years of carefully constructed lies collapse in real time. "Your Honor," Foster said, her voice cracking with barely controlled panic, "I need to speak with my attorney. This entire proceeding has become a witch hunt designed to destroy my reputation and career." Judge Harrison regarded her with the calm composure of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. "Detective Foster, you are currently testifying as a witness in Miss Taylor's case. If you wish to invoke your Fifth Amendment rights, you may do so. But understand that your testimony up to this point has been given under oath and is part of the official record." Foster's hands were shaking now, her face cycling between pale white and flushed red as she struggled to process the magnitude of her situation. Every word she had spoken, every confession she had made, had been documented by court reporters and recorded by multiple devices. There was no way to unsay what she had revealed about her systematic targeting of black youth. "This is all a setup," Foster said desperately, her voice rising to a level that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. "You planned this whole thing to entrap me. You're not interested in justice. You're interested in destroying a good cop who's been trying to clean up these streets." But the judge wasn't done with her yet. Judge Harrison opened another section of his evidence folder, pulling out documents that bore official FBI letterhead and classification stamps. Foster's eyes widened as she recognized federal law enforcement insignia, understanding for the first time that her crimes had attracted attention far beyond the local courthouse. "Detective Foster," Judge Harrison said, "what you don't seem to understand is that this case stopped being about Jasmine Taylor the moment you confessed to murdering Andre Robinson. Federal authorities have been monitoring this proceeding based on evidence that was brought to their attention months ago." As if summoned by his words, the courtroom's rear doors opened to admit 3 individuals in dark suits, their movements precise and purposeful. The lead figure, a stern-faced man with graying hair, approached the bench with credentials already in hand. "Your Honor, I'm Special Agent Christopher Palmer with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. We have warrants for Detective Foster's arrest on federal charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice." Foster looked around the courtroom with wild eyes, perhaps only now understanding that her assault on judicial authority had been witnessed not just by local court personnel, but by federal law enforcement officials who had been building a case against her for months. "This is impossible," Foster said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Internal affairs cleared me. The DA's office reviewed the case. I followed department protocol." Agent Palmer approached Foster with handcuffs, his expression professionally neutral, but his intent unmistakable. "Detective Rebecca Foster, you are under arrest for violations of federal civil rights law. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Foster's legs seemed to give way as the reality of her situation became unavoidable. The career she had built on lies and violence was ending in federal handcuffs, her crimes exposed before the very community she had terrorized for years. "You people set me up," Foster snarled, her voice filled with the same racial hatred that had driven her policing career. This whole thing was a conspiracy to destroy a good cop who wasn't afraid to do what needed to be done. Judge Harrison stood slowly, his movement commanding immediate attention from everyone in the courtroom. "Detective Foster, the only person who destroyed your career was you. Every confession came from your mouth, every crime was your choice. And now you're going to face the consequences that you thought would never come." What she said next crossed every line imaginable. As Agent Palmer began reading Foster her Miranda rights, Judge Harrison realized there was one more piece of evidence that needed to be revealed before federal authorities took Foster into custody. The audio recording they had just heard was damning, but there was another conversation, one that would expose the full scope of the conspiracy that had protected Foster's crimes for years. "Agent Palmer," Judge Harrison said, "before you process Detective Foster's arrest, there's additional evidence that your investigation team needs to hear. Evidence that reveals this conspiracy extends far beyond one officer's individual crimes. Foster's face went from pale to grey as Judge Harrison gestured for Gabriel Santos to load another audio file. Her desperate attempts to maintain innocence had been shattered by her own recorded confessions, but what was about to be played would destroy any hope of claiming her actions were aberrations rather than department policy. What the court is about to hear, Judge Harrison announced, is a recording of Detective Foster discussing her methods with Captain Victoria Bradley, the commanding officer of the East Side Precinct. This conversation took place 6 months ago at the annual Police Benevolent Association dinner. Her reaction when the video started playing was priceless. The speakers crackled to life with the sound of a crowded restaurant. Glasses clinking and multiple conversations creating a backdrop of ambient noise. Foster's voice emerged clearly, slightly intoxicated, but unmistakably discussing her approach to policing black youth. "Captain Bradley," Foster's recorded voice said, "I want to thank you for backing me up on the Robinson shooting. Some of the younger officers have been asking questions about my methods. And it's good to know command has my back." Bradley's gravelly voice responded with casual authority. "Rebecca, you do what needs to be done to keep these streets safe. The public doesn't understand the reality of policing urban communities. Sometimes you have to send a message that sticks." Foster laughed, the sound chilling in its casual cruelty. "That's exactly what I told Cooper. The Robinson kid was perfect for that. Young, cocky, thought he could walk around my beat without showing proper respect. His death taught every other punk in the neighborhood what happens when you don't comply immediately." Bradley's response revealed the institutional support that had enabled Foster's crimes. "The key is making sure the paperwork tells the right story. As long as the reports show legitimate threat indicators, internal affairs will back us up every time." The courtroom listened in horrified silence as 2 police officials discussed fabricating evidence and covering up murders as routine administrative tasks. Foster's current face had gone completely white as she heard her own voice describing Andre Robinson's execution as a deliberate act of terrorism against the black community. "But wait, there's more evidence you haven't seen yet." The recording continued with Bradley providing specific instructions on how to manipulate incident reports to justify excessive force. "Always mention aggressive posturing and failure to comply," Bradley's voice explained. "Those phrases give review boards the language they need to rule shootings justified, even when the circumstances are questionable." Foster's recorded voice expressed gratitude for the guidance. "That's brilliant, Captain. I've been using variations of those exact phrases in every report. The beauty is that you can apply them to almost any behavior. Eye contact, body language, tone of voice. It's impossible to prove what someone's posture really meant." The conversation revealed a systematic approach to criminalizing normal human behavior, particularly when that behavior came from black teenagers who refused to display the immediate submission that Foster demanded. Judge Harrison could see faces in the gallery, processing the realization that they had just heard police officials describe the deliberate fabrication of evidence as standard operating procedure. Agent Palmer had stopped reading Foster her rights, understanding that the evidence being revealed would fundamentally change the scope of his investigation. This wasn't just about one corrupt officer. It was about an entire command structure that had institutionalized racial violence and cover-ups. Foster tried to interrupt the playback, her voice cracking with desperation. "Your Honor, these conversations are being taken completely out of context. Officers discuss hypothetical scenarios all the time." "Detective Foster," Judge Harrison said with devastating calm, "there's nothing hypothetical about Andre Robinson's death. There's nothing hypothetical about the 16 other black teenagers you've arrested on fabricated charges. And there's nothing hypothetical about the conspiracy we just heard between you and your commanding officers." The weight of institutional corruption hung over the courtroom like a toxic cloud, making every breath feel labored and dangerous. The next 5 minutes will blow your mind. The revelation of institutional conspiracy had stripped away Foster's last hope of claiming her crimes were individual aberrations. Faced with audio evidence of systematic cover-ups involving her immediate supervisors, Foster's psychological defenses finally collapsed completely. What emerged was the raw, unfiltered hatred that had always driven her policing career. "You want the truth?" Foster screamed, her voice echoing off the marble walls of the courtroom with desperate fury. "Fine. I'll give you the goddamn truth about what it's really like policing these neighborhoods." Agent Palmer moved closer to Foster, understanding that a complete psychological breakdown was imminent, and preparing to intervene if she became physically dangerous. Judge Harrison remained behind the bench, his composed demeanor providing a stark contrast to Foster's unraveling sanity. "These people," Foster's voice cracked as years of suppressed rage poured out, "they don't understand respect, they don't understand authority. They think they can walk around with attitude problems and challenging looks, and we're supposed to just take it." The phrase "these people" had become Foster's verbal signature, revealing her worldview with crystalline clarity. Judge Harrison observed her meltdown with the clinical detachment of someone who had spent decades studying the psychology of institutional racism. "What she said next will shock you." Foster's hands were shaking violently now, her face flushed red with the kind of rage that preceded either complete collapse or explosive violence. "You sit up there in your fancy robe, pretending to care about justice, but you don't know what it's like dealing with gangbangers and drug dealers and wannabe thugs every single day." "Detective Foster," Judge Harrison said, his voice remaining calm despite the obvious threat in her demeanor, "Andre Robinson was employed at a grocery store. Jasmine Taylor is an honor roll student. Neither of them were gang members or drug dealers." Foster's response revealed the depth of her delusions. "They all start somewhere. That Robinson kid was already showing signs. The way he walked, the way he looked at me, the attitude in his voice when I tried to question him. I've been doing this long enough to recognize the pattern." The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Foster confessed to profiling and executing children based on nothing more than her racist interpretations of normal adolescent behavior. Her psychological collapse was providing a masterclass in how institutional prejudice justified itself through dehumanization and fantasy. "And you," Foster suddenly pointed directly at Judge Harrison, her finger trembling with rage, "you're the worst kind, pretending to be some kind of moral authority while protecting criminals and gang members. You think your law degree makes you better than officers who risk their lives every day." Judge Harrison felt the collective intake of breath from the gallery as Foster's verbal assault took on increasingly personal and threatening tones. But he also felt something else, the satisfaction of watching a system's true nature reveal itself so completely that denial became impossible. "This is where it gets really good." Foster's rant continued with escalating intensity. "I protected this community from people like that Robinson kid for 15 years. I prevented crimes before they happened. I saved lives by stopping these punks before they could hurt innocent people." The delusion was complete. Foster genuinely believed that murdering unarmed children constituted heroic police work. Her psychological framework had twisted reality so thoroughly that she saw herself as a protector rather than a predator. "Detective Foster," Judge Harrison said, his voice cutting through her tirade like a surgical blade, "you murdered a 16-year-old boy who was walking home from work. You terrorized dozens of children whose only crime was existing while black. You are not a protector. You are exactly the kind of criminal that good police officers are supposed to stop." Foster's face went through a series of expressions: rage, desperation, and finally the cold calculation of a cornered animal preparing to attack. Her next words would cross every line of courtroom decorum and personal dignity. "You know what your problem is?" Foster snarled, taking a step toward the bench with obvious menace. "You people think you're equal to us now. You think wearing a judge's robe or a fancy suit changes what you really are. But I know what you are underneath all that pretense." The silence that followed was electric with tension, everyone in the courtroom understanding that Foster was about to commit an act that would destroy her completely and irreversibly. The slap that ended everything was about to happen. The tension in courtroom 7A had reached a breaking point, the air itself seeming to vibrate with the energy of impending violence. Foster stood less than 6 feet from Judge Harrison's bench, her face twisted with the kind of rage that preceded either total breakdown or explosive action. Every person in the room could feel that something terrible was about to happen. "You think you're untouchable up there?" Foster continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the courtroom. "I think that robe protects you from the real world, but I know what you really are, just another uppity." "Detective Foster," Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice carrying the full authority of judicial power, "you will address this court with respect, or you will be held in contempt. Your career is over, your crimes are exposed, and your freedom is about to end. Don't make this worse for yourself." Foster's response was to laugh, a harsh, bitter sound that contained no humor but boundless hatred. "Make it worse? Sir, you just destroyed my entire life based on some edited recordings and conspiracy theories. You think I have anything left to lose?" Agent Palmer had moved closer to Foster's position, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon as he recognized the signs of someone preparing for violence. The court security officers were tensing for action, understanding that Foster's military training and desperate mindset made her extremely dangerous. The moment that ended everything was about to happen. Foster took another step toward the bench, her movement aggressive enough to trigger immediate responses from security personnel. But Judge Harrison raised his hand, stopping the officers before they could intervene. He had spent his entire career refusing to be intimidated by people who believed their anger granted them special privileges. "Detective Foster," he said, rising to his full height behind the bench, "you have confessed to murder, admitted to systematic racism, and revealed a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of your department. The only thing you can do now is accept responsibility for your crimes and hope that federal prosecutors show you more mercy than you showed Andre Robinson." Foster's face went through a final transformation from rage to calculation to cold, murderous intent. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat authority of someone who had made a decision that couldn't be undone. "You know what, Your Honor? I think it's time someone taught you what real authority looks like." Foster's leg swung in a vicious arc, her tactical boot connecting with Judge Harrison's midsection with enough force to lift him off his feet. The impact sent him crashing backward into his chair, the sound of the blow echoing through the marble courtroom like thunder. Crack! The kick landed with devastating force, Judge Harrison's frame absorbing an assault that could have seriously injured or killed someone. But even as he doubled over in pain, his eyes never closed, his dignity never wavered. He absorbed Foster's violence with the same composure he had shown throughout the hearing, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing him broken. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Agent Palmer drew his weapon while court security officers rushed Foster from multiple angles. Spectators screamed and dove for cover, while court personnel activated emergency protocols designed for exactly this kind of catastrophic breakdown of order. Foster stood over Judge Harrison's fallen form like a conqueror, her face twisted with the savage satisfaction of someone who had finally expressed her true nature without restraint. "That's what happens when you forget your place," she snarled, her voice carrying throughout the courtroom despite the chaos around her. But her moment of triumph was brief. Agent Palmer's voice cut through the noise with sharp authority. "Rebecca Foster, you are under federal arrest for assault on a federal judicial officer, a crime punishable by up to 20 years in federal prison." Security officers swarmed Foster, wrestling her to the ground with professional efficiency, despite her attempts to resist. The woman who had entered the courtroom with swagger and untouchable confidence was now face down on the marble floor, federal handcuffs cutting into her wrists, while a dozen witnesses documented her complete psychological and professional collapse. But wait, there's more evidence you haven't seen yet. Judge Harrison slowly pulled himself upright, his face pale but his expression unchanged. The red mark where Foster's boot had connected was already beginning to show, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. "Let the record show that Detective Rebecca Foster has physically assaulted a sitting federal judge in open court, before multiple federal witnesses." As Foster was restrained on the courtroom floor, Agent Palmer coordinated with his backup team through subtle hand signals that indicated a much larger operation was already in motion. The assault on Judge Harrison had been witnessed by federal agents, but Foster's arrest was only the beginning of what would become the most comprehensive civil rights investigation in the region's history. "Your Honor," Agent Palmer said, approaching the bench while keeping his weapon trained on Foster's prone form, We've been conducting a parallel investigation into Detective Foster's activities for the past 8 months. What happened here today provides the final evidence we needed to move against her entire network. Judge Harrison accepted a glass of water from Gabriel Santos, using the moment to compose himself while processing the implications of Agent Palmer's words. The federal investigation had been running concurrently with his own evidence gathering, suggesting a level of coordination that Foster couldn't have anticipated. "How extensive is your investigation, Agent Palmer?" Judge Harrison asked, his voice steady despite the pain from Foster's assault. Agent Palmer gestured toward the courtroom doors, where additional federal agents were entering with briefcases and electronic equipment. "We have warrants for 12 officers in Foster's precinct, including Captain Bradley and Lieutenant Cooper. We're executing simultaneous raids on 4 police stations, seizing computers, files, and surveillance equipment as we speak." Foster lifted her head from the floor, her face a mask of rage and disbelief. "This is impossible. Internal Affairs cleared every case. The DA's office reviewed everything." Her reaction when she realized the scope was priceless. Agent Palmer looked down at Foster with professional detachment. "Detective Foster, the federal investigation began when Mrs. Diana Robinson, Andre's mother, contacted our Civil Rights Division with evidence that local authorities had ignored for 2 years. She kept copies of everything, including the original incident reports that mysteriously disappeared from police files. The revelation that Andre Robinson's mother had been working with federal investigators added another layer to Foster's nightmare. Her carefully constructed cover-up had been unraveling for months while she remained oblivious to the forces building against her. "We also received cooperation from Detective Raymond Barnes in Internal Affairs," Agent Palmer continued, "who provided documentation showing systematic destruction of evidence and intimidation of witnesses. Your own supervisor, Captain Bradley, is currently being arrested at her home based on the conspiracy charges revealed in today's recordings." Foster's psychological collapse accelerated as she realized the full scope of the federal operation. "You people planned this whole thing. This entire hearing was a setup." Judge Harrison stood slowly, his dignity intact despite Foster's assault. "Detective Foster, this hearing was about Jasmine Taylor's right to exist without being criminalized for her race. The fact that your own confessions exposed a murder conspiracy was your choice, not our plan." Agent Palmer's radio crackled with updates from other teams. "Command, we have Bradley in custody. Cooper is resisting arrest but contained. We've seized approximately 400 case files and 17 computer hard drives from the East Side precinct." The operation's scope was staggering. This wasn't just about Foster's individual crimes, but about dismantling an entire network of corrupt officers who had been systematically abusing their authority while enjoying administrative protection. "You won't believe what happens next." Foster was hauled to her feet by security officers, her face cycling between rage and panic as the reality of her situation became undeniable. "This is all because of that one punk kid. Everything was fine until you people started stirring up trouble." Judge Harrison felt a cold satisfaction as he watched Foster's worldview crumble in real time. For 15 years, she had terrorized black youth with the confidence that the system would protect her. Now that same system was turning against her with the full force of federal law enforcement. "Detective Foster," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "Andre Robinson was not one punk kid. He was a 16-year-old boy with a family who loved him, a job he took pride in, and a future you stole from him. And now you're going to face justice for that theft." As Foster was led away in federal custody, her footsteps echoing through the marble halls where she had once strutted with unquestioned authority, Judge Harrison understood that they had witnessed something larger than one woman's downfall. They had seen a system finally holding itself accountable. The best part is coming up. Within hours of Foster's arrest, the FBI's coordinated operation had netted 17 officers from 3 different precincts, each facing federal charges ranging from civil rights violations to conspiracy to commit murder. The scope of the corruption extended far beyond what even Judge Harrison had imagined during his months of investigation. Captain Victoria Bradley was arrested at her suburban home while eating dinner with her family. The image of her being led away in handcuffs becoming the lead story on every local news channel. Lieutenant Jennifer Cooper attempted to barricade herself in her office at headquarters, destroying documents until federal agents breached the door and found her feeding papers into a paper shredder. But the most devastating blow to the conspiracy came from an unexpected source, Detective Raymond Barnes, who had been secretly recording conversations with his colleagues for over a year while building his own case against the corruption in his department. You won't believe what he captured on tape. Agent Christopher Palmer, no relation to the detective, had established a command center in the courthouse's conference room, coordinating arrests while reviewing the evidence that had been accumulating for months. Judge Harrison joined the briefing, still bearing the visible marks of Foster's assault, but determined to see the investigation through to its conclusion. "Your Honor," Agent Palmer said, spreading photographs and documents across the conference table, Detective Barnes's recordings reveal that Foster's methods were not only known to her supervisors, they were actively encouraged as a model for other officers to follow. The photographs showed training sessions where Foster had been presented as an example of proactive policing, teaching younger officers how to identify pre-criminal behavior in minority youth. The euphemisms couldn't hide the reality. Foster had been training an entire generation of officers to view black teenagers as inherently suspicious and deserving of aggressive intervention. One recording captured Bradley addressing a group of new recruits. Detective Foster has shown exceptional skill in preventing crimes before they occur. Her ability to identify troublemakers and address problems early has made her patrol area one of the safest in the county. The troublemakers Bradley referenced were children like Andre Robinson and Jasmine Taylor, teenagers whose only crimes were existing while black in Foster's territory. The problems that were addressed early were fundamental constitutional rights that Foster had been systematically violating with departmental approval. What they found in the files will shock you. The evidence seized from police computers revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Internal emails showed Bradley and Cooper coordinating stories for problematic shootings, with specific instructions on how to modify incident reports to ensure favorable outcomes from review boards. One email from Cooper to Bradley read, "Foster's latest incident needs narrative adjustment. Original report mentions subject was retreating. Recommend revision to emphasize threat indicators and officer safety concerns." Bradley's response was equally damning. "Already in progress. Internal affairs review scheduled for next month. Media interest minimal. Family unlikely to pursue civil action due to subject's juvenile record." The casual way these officials discussed manipulating evidence and covering up potential murders revealed an institutional culture where protecting killer cops was standard operating procedure. Judge Harrison felt nauseated reading the clinical language used to describe the destruction of families and the denial of justice. But the investigation's most shocking revelation came from financial records showing that Foster and her conspirators had been receiving bonuses for maintaining low crime statistics in their patrol areas. The department had been literally paying officers to reduce reported crime, creating incentives for either covering up actual crimes or preventing them through intimidation and violence. Wait until you see what happened to the other officers. By evening, 3 more officers had negotiated plea agreements in exchange for testimony against their superiors. Detective Michelle Graham, ironically sharing a last name with one of Foster's victims, provided detailed accounts of Bradley's instruction sessions on evidence manipulation and witness intimidation. Officer Daniel Reed revealed that Foster had boasted about teaching respect to ungrateful teenagers during department social events, describing her shooting of Andre Robinson as necessary education for the community. The web of corruption extended beyond individual officers to include prosecutors who had routinely accepted Foster's fabricated reports without investigation and internal affairs investigators who had buried complaints against her in exchange for promotions and favorable assignments. Foster's reign of terror had been enabled by an entire ecosystem of institutional complicity, where every level of the justice system had prioritized protecting police over protecting citizens. Justice was finally coming for everyone involved. The federal investigation expanded beyond Riverside County as similar patterns of abuse emerged in neighboring jurisdictions. Agent Palmer's team discovered that Foster's methods had been shared through informal networks of police trainers and consultants, spreading her toxic approach to policing across multiple states. 3 weeks after Foster's arrest, the Department of Justice announced the largest civil rights investigation in decades, encompassing 14 police departments and involving over 200 officers who had either participated in or enabled systematic abuse of minority youth. The scope of this corruption will blow your mind. Attorney General Katherine Hudson held a press conference announcing the formation of a federal task force with unlimited resources and subpoena power. What we have uncovered in Riverside County represents a betrayal of everything law enforcement is supposed to stand for, she declared. This investigation will follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of rank or political connections. The task force's first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source: police body camera footage that had been automatically uploaded to cloud servers but never reviewed by supervisors. Months of accumulated video revealed hundreds of interactions where officers used Foster's methods to terrorize minority youth, often while discussing their techniques in ways that left no doubt about their racial motivations. One particularly damning video showed Officer Samantha Price, one of Foster's protégés, stopping a 14-year-old black girl for suspicious walking patterns. When the girl asked why she was being detained, Price responded, "Foster taught me that you people always try to lawyer up when you're caught. That's how we know you're guilty of something." The phrase "you people" had become a signature of Foster's disciples, revealing how her racist worldview had infected an entire generation of officers. Federal investigators began using that specific language as a search term in police communications, uncovering a network of corruption that spanned multiple agencies. What they discovered in the secret communications will shock you. The investigation revealed that Foster had been operating as part of an informal brotherhood of officers who shared intelligence about problem families and coordinated responses to community complaints. Text message threads showed officers warning each other about activist parents who might document their children's encounters with police. One message thread included Foster writing, "Robinson family still asking questions about their son. Might need additional pressure to encourage them to move on." The response from Officer Lauren Mitchell was equally chilling. "Already spread word through informants that family is uncooperative with police. Should create enough social pressure to keep them quiet." These messages revealed that Andre Robinson's family had been subjected to systematic harassment designed to prevent them from seeking justice for their son's murder. The cruelty was breathtaking, using community fear of police retaliation to isolate grieving parents and protect killer cops. Federal prosecutors had begun preparing RICO charges, treating Foster's network as a criminal organization that had used their law enforcement positions to commit ongoing crimes against the civil rights of minority citizens. The maximum penalties under federal civil rights statutes could result in life sentences for the most serious offenders. 6 months after Foster's violent assault in Courtroom 7A, the federal prosecutions were delivering justice with surgical precision. Foster herself had been convicted on 17 federal charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge specifically noting that her assault on Judge Harrison demonstrated an absolute rejection of the rule of law and constitutional government. Captain Bradley received 45 years for conspiracy and civil rights violations, while Lieutenant Cooper was sentenced to 30 years for her role in covering up murders and intimidating witnesses. The sentences sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide, serving notice that institutional racism would no longer be protected by administrative indifference. Justice was finally being served, but the best part was yet to come. Mrs. Diana Robinson, Andre's mother, had become the face of the federal civil rights case, her dignity and persistent demands for justice inspiring similar families across the country to come forward with their own stories of police abuse. Standing outside the federal courthouse after Foster's sentencing, she spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had transformed personal tragedy into systemic change. "My son Andre was murdered by a woman who thought black children's lives were worthless," she said, her voice carrying to the crowd of supporters who had gathered to witness this historic moment. But his death was not in vain if it prevents other mothers from experiencing this pain. The federal investigation had ultimately identified 47 families whose children had been victimized by Foster's network, each receiving substantial financial settlements, but more importantly, official acknowledgement that their children had been wronged by the system that was supposed to protect them. Jasmine Taylor, now 16 and thriving in her junior year of high school, had become an advocate for police reform and youth rights. Her experience in Judge Harrison's courtroom had taught her that speaking truth to power was not just possible, but essential for creating change. "I used to be afraid of police officers," Jasmine said during a speech at a youth leadership conference. "Now I understand that good officers want the same thing we do. Safe communities where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. The bad officers were afraid of us because they knew we could expose their lies." The changes that happened next transformed everything. Judge Harrison had declined multiple offers to join higher courts, choosing instead to remain in criminal court where he could continue protecting vulnerable youth from systemic abuse. His chambers had become a model for judicial activism, with judges from across the country seeking his guidance on identifying and confronting institutional racism in their own courtrooms. The Riverside County Police Department underwent complete restructuring under federal oversight, with new leadership, revised training protocols, and community accountability measures that served as a template for departments nationwide. Body camera policies were revised to prevent the kind of technical difficulties that had allowed Foster's crimes to be covered up for years. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural, the recognition that silence in the face of injustice was no longer acceptable, that good people had a moral obligation to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost. Gabriel Santos, the court administrator who had preserved the evidence that destroyed Foster, was promoted to Director of Court Security and became a national expert on protecting judicial proceedings from corrupt law enforcement. His courage in exposing Foster's crimes had prevented dozens of other families from experiencing the Robinson family's tragedy. What happened next will restore your faith in justice. The memorial garden planted outside the courthouse in Andre Robinson's memory had become a gathering place for families who had lost children to police violence, a space where grief could be shared and hope could be nurtured. Mrs. Robinson tended the roses planted in her son's honor, finding peace in the knowledge that his death had catalyzed changes that would protect future generations. Detective Raymond Barnes, the Internal Affairs Officer, whose secret recordings had provided crucial evidence, was appointed as the first civilian director of police accountability, with authority to investigate misconduct complaints without interference from police administration. His appointment marked a fundamental shift in how police departments would be held accountable for their officers' actions. The ripple effects of Foster's exposure extended far beyond Riverside County, inspiring federal investigations in 12 other states and leading to the conviction of over 300 corrupt officers who had been operating with similar impunity. The final transformation will leave you speechless. 2 years after the kick that echoed through the halls of justice, Judge Terrence Harrison received an unexpected visitor in his chambers. Mrs. Diana Robinson knocked softly on the door, carrying a small wrapped package and wearing the peaceful expression of someone who had found closure after years of grief and struggle. "Judge Harrison," Mrs. Robinson said, settling into the chair across from the desk, "I wanted to thank you personally for having the courage to stand up when it mattered. Andre's death finally has meaning, because you refused to let Foster hide behind her badge." The package contained a framed photograph of Andre Robinson at his high school graduation, smiling with the bright optimism of a young man who believed the future held unlimited possibilities. Beneath the photo was an engraved plaque reading, "Justice delayed is not justice denied, when good people decide to speak truth to power." Judge Harrison felt tears gathering in his eyes as he studied Andre's face, seeing in his expression the same dignity and hope that he had witnessed in countless young people who had appeared in his courtroom seeking protection from a system that too often failed them. The legacy that emerged will inspire generations. The Foster case had become a watershed moment in American civil rights history, studied in law schools and police academies as an example of how institutional racism operates and how it can be dismantled through persistent courage and documentation. Judge Harrison's refusal to be intimidated by Foster's violence had demonstrated that the rule of law could prevail over the rule of force when good people refused to remain silent. The federal consent decree governing the Riverside County Police Department had become a model for police reform nationwide, with provisions requiring implicit bias training, community oversight, and transparent investigation of misconduct complaints. Crime rates in formerly over-policed neighborhoods had actually decreased as community trust in law enforcement was rebuilt through accountability and respect. Most importantly, young people in Foster's former patrol area no longer lived in fear of police encounters. The systematic terrorization of black youth had ended, replaced by community policing models that emphasized protection rather than intimidation. But the most powerful change was invisible yet transformative. Jasmine Taylor had graduated as valedictorian of her high school class, earning a full scholarship to study criminal justice at Howard University. In her graduation speech, she spoke about the day in courtroom 7A that had changed her understanding of power and justice. "I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear," Jasmine said to the packed auditorium. "Courage is doing what's right even when you're terrified. Judge Harrison showed me that one person willing to stand up can change everything." The scholarship fund established in Andre Robinson's memory had provided educational opportunities for over 200 young people who had been victimized by police misconduct, transforming trauma into opportunity and ensuring that Foster's victims could build the futures she had tried to destroy. Judge Harrison kept Andre's photograph on his desk as a daily reminder that justice work required both professional competence and personal courage. Every case that came before his bench was an opportunity to either perpetuate systemic failures or create space for healing and accountability. The courthouse steps where Mrs. Robinson had once stood alone, demanding justice for her murdered son, now hosted regular community meetings where residents worked with police officials to build trust and prevent the kind of corruption that had flourished in darkness. As evening fell over the courthouse where so much healing had begun, Judge Harrison prepared to leave for home, where his husband waited with dinner and stories of his own day saving lives as a trauma surgeon. The red mark from Foster's assault had long since faded, but the memory of that moment, when he chose dignity over retaliation, when he let Foster's violence expose itself rather than meeting it with violence of his own, remained as vivid as ever. Foster herself was serving her life sentence in federal prison. Her days spent in protective custody, away from the general population, that included many of the young men whose lives she had destroyed through false arrests and fabricated charges. Her name had become synonymous with police corruption, a cautionary tale taught to every new recruit about what happened when officers forgot their oath to serve and protect. But Judge Harrison's legacy was different. His name was spoken with reverence in communities that had learned to trust the justice system again. In law schools where students studied his techniques for confronting institutional racism, and in courtrooms where other judges found courage to challenge corruption rather than enabling it. The lesson was simple but transformative. Sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is simply refusing to be broken by it, standing firm until truth wins, and choosing to stay where the work matters most, rather than seeking personal advancement or safety. Some battles are won not through force, but through the quiet courage of refusing to step away when stepping away would be easier. Judge Terrence Harrison had chosen to stay in criminal court, and in staying, had reminded an entire nation what justice looks like when it refuses to be silenced. The courthouse lights dimmed as another day of seeking justice came to an end, but the work would resume tomorrow and the day after that, and for as many days as children needed someone to stand between them and those who would abuse their power. Foster's kick had been intended to silence Judge Harrison, to put him in his place, as she had put so many others. Instead, it had become the moment when her entire world of lies and violence collapsed, when the system she had corrupted finally turned against her with the full force of federal law. If you're a young person watching this, Remember that Jasmine Taylor was just 15 when she stood up to Foster's intimidation. If you're a parent, remember that Mrs. Robinson never stopped demanding justice for her son. If you're someone in authority, remember that Judge Harrison could have taken the easy path, but chose to fight for what was right. The most important lesson from this story is that change begins with one person deciding that enough is enough. Foster thought her badge made her untouchable. She thought her racism would be protected by institutional silence. She thought violence would silence those who challenged her authority. She was wrong on every count, because she encountered people who understood that some principles are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Today, Andre Robinson's name is engraved on a monument to civil rights heroes outside the Riverside County Courthouse. Jasmine Taylor is studying to become a civil rights attorney. Mrs. Robinson leads a foundation that provides legal support to families seeking justice for police misconduct. Judge Harrison continues his work protecting vulnerable youth from systematic abuse. And Foster. She spends her days in a 6x8 cell, surrounded by the consequences of choices that seemed so powerful when she was making them, but proved to be nothing more than the desperate acts of a small person who confused cruelty with strength. Justice doesn't always move quickly, but when good people refuse to give up, it moves inevitably toward truth. Foster thought her badge made her untouchable, but she was wrong. Judge Harrison showed us that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is refusing to be broken by it. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and shared your locations with us. Seeing this global community united for accountability and truth proves that justice is a universal human value. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more stories of courage triumphing over corruption. Until next time, remember that one person's refusal to be silenced can change an entire system. Until the next story that proves truth always wins.